on the matter of criminals driving fear into our state.
But the details of that, you'd have to speak to the relevant authorities.
Imagine our state being afraid to act in the face of a gang. This new dimension of a criminal gang. On the matter of criminals driving fear into our state. Imagine our state being afraid to act in the face of a gang. This new dimension of a criminal gang.
Interesting overview, Prime Minister, of one of the most critical challenges facing the country. But I put to you what your critics say. They say you promised the country safety and security when seeking office, and that you are failing to deliver. And I suppose the more direct question is, what do you say to the men and women in tough communities across the country who have to be ducking gunshots and they live in fear literally every second that they could die?
Right, so without question, that was not a promise, that was a commitment, and we remain absolutely committed to that.
On the matter of criminals driving fear into our state. Imagine our state being afraid to act in the face of a gang. This new dimension of a criminal gang.
Of things.
Come on, here's first one.
Get up! Get up, I'm going to leave, huh? Get shot. Oh my God. Drive.
Interesting overview, Prime Minister, of one of the most critical challenges facing the country. But I put to you what your critics say. They say you promised the country safety and security when seeking office, and that you are failing to deliver. And I suppose the more direct question is, what do you say to the men and women in tough communities across the country who have to be ducking gunshots and they live in fear literally every second that they could die?
Right, so without question, That was not a promise, that was a commitment. And we remain absolutely committed to that.
It won't stop at inner city people, at poor people, because it's only when it affects a certain geography, a certain area, that it apparently becomes a matter of concern that the state must act.
Our heads of the security forces, I know them well, that they don't stand for that. So I have had several discussions with the Chief of Defense Staff and the Minister of National Security, and we are monitoring this very closely. We have given certain instructions about the conduct of the security forces in those areas, and we expect that those directives will be properly and thoroughly executed to ensure that we preserve life and enhance the security of the citizens, which is what, and I think everyone who wears a uniform and is under oath to serve and protect must understand that directive of the government. We must be serving and protecting our citizens. So you can have confidence in your state. I know it's a hard thing to accept given the past of where we're coming from, but we can't continue to dwell in the past.
The government has spent on average $9.7 billion on capital investments in national security over the last 8 years since 2016, compared with approximately $3.2 billion over the 8-year period prior to 2016. We have invested 3 times as much in security than any previous administration. So, Madam Speaker, I wish to commend the Commissioner of Police and thank the hard-working men and women of the JCF for their committed effort and dedicated service to the country. Madam Speaker, I'll say a few words about the JDF as Minister of Defense and Chairman of the National Security Council. The JDF is critical to all lines of effort in Plan Secure Jamaica. You know, Madam Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition spoke about the militarization of our security forces. By the way, it's the same Leader of the Opposition who calls for more boots on the ground. If there is ever any problem in his constituency, which we have similar constituencies, the call is more boots on the ground. However, Madam Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition pointed out that we have made massive investments in the JDF. And that's why we build the capacity to be able to respond. In 2022, 491 JNSC applicants or participants successfully completed their 1-year training and entered the regular JDF.
Mowgli shoot up 19 face. Enough of that,
But you can't cry some say I want them style soldier. What we look, and we want one for them no police, be a soldier that pushes them come for kill. What? Boy just out school, and how much more subject just out Calabar. Them going in and beating them, jumping and especially big man soldier. Me I thought right time I come downstairs and blood up and say, blood up with the two of them head, some go start hold them. The girl, the soldier girl, grab me by my pants. And they move on that stuff, and the way of them start, so the way of them shoot it down. Chip up. I do them not just talk and them beat me two better them in front of me. 16-year-old upstairs. She live around your son. All of them shit. I need to time at the house a while ago. When the gun shot them on fire, she don't go left or right. If the tell her to go left or right, she don't go left or right. I never asked to bring her.
How old is the child?
She's 2. She's 2 to the baby upstairs there. She not got her clothes. And at the yard she did a while ago. She don't know where to go. Right here. She had 2 years.
It won't stop at inner city people, at poor people, because it's only when it affects a certain geography, a certain area, that it apparently becomes a matter of concern that the state must act.
And now do nothing till somebody gets stabbed and dead out there. Yeah man, that's enough to sit down and talk. Yeah man, that's enough to sit down and talk. Solve so much people around it. What do you mean so much people? What do you mean so much people? And this is the domestic thing where the people are talk about, and the sit down and the zones of the man sit things out now, nah do nothing. One of they are do.
Zones of special operations remain relevant and in the current fight to restore law and order in certain communities. Lead to borrow a phrase, the zones of special op may be the best example of what we call proximity policing. They're very
tactics, the tactics employed by the security forces in the zones. There is a perception that essentially there are sedentary checkpoints across the zones where, police and soldiers sit under a tent for many hours, well, on an ongoing basis, really. But there isn't really sufficient attention being paid to what may be going on in fairly close proximity to those checkpoints. And so you have flare-ups of intense violence, even in a community which has been under a zone for over 5 years. I mean, we've been hearing just recently the reports in Denham Town of serious violence, murders being committed, people being shot, and so on. My concern is in relation to the tactics being deployed, why do we not have more patrols, patrols on an ongoing basis so that the people see the security?
Just a minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm just asking why we do not have a variation of the strategy to have more mobility in the communities on the part of the security forces, rather having them immobilized at checkpoints for hours on end. Many of them are on their phones, no doubt cramped with boredom because nothing is happening right there. But there are issues around in close proximity. They need to be mobile. They need to move around the communities and be seen so that there can be less, their activities or their sedentary lack of activities is less predictable. And, whether they can be supported by cameras, CCTV cameras, Jamaica Eye, can we see the rollout of those in these communities to be a further disincentive to the criminals? What about the use of drones to monitor what is happening, especially at times when there's a flare? It might not be all the time, because when things are quiet, it's not necessary. But when there's a descent into an episode which is going to result in reprisals and so on, unfortunately, what tactics can be brought to kind of keep the peace and calm in those communities? I think that the security tactics that are being employed are inadequate. And it kind of brings the zones into disrepute when you see a situation where a community that has had hundreds of millions of dollars expended on it, on social improvements, social transformation, way beyond what is available to other communities which are in similar situations, and yet still violence continues to be a problem there. One wonders, is this really working? And we want it to work. So I'm just questioning whether the security aspects of it couldn't be fine-tuned to make them more effective. So
yes, sir! Yes, sir! Stop now. Good. You're not excuse the law. If the soldier stop you, you stop. If the soldier stop you, you stop. You say, if the soldier stop you, you stop, sir. You don't come and move the barrier.
Think about it. Elections from 72, 76, 80, well, 83, but 89 and into the 90s, they were violent. But we changed it. I offer, again, my hand in consensus. We have to come to a consensus on how to treat with violence. By the 1990s, organized, intentional, fatal violence, which is gang-related murders mostly, escalated as gangs started to use violence in furtherance of the regional narcotics trade. By 2005, 43 years after independence, when we only had 63 murders, Jamaica recorded its highest murder tally of 1,647. Violence as a social disease and a behavioral problem has become a public health crisis of epidemic proportions. On top of this social context, violence is now a dominant feature of crime, particularly fatal violence organized by gangs in furtherance of their criminal enterprise. Both streams of violence have devastating impact on the quality of life and security of the citizens. However, violence in its organized form, pursuing criminal enterprises, be it drug trade, lottery scamming, extortion, human trafficking, guns trafficking, counterfeit goods, cyber crimes, or turf war, is now at a level where it is a threat to the effective functioning of the state. By any definition, the current situation is not acceptable in a free and democratic country and can only be described as a state of emergency. Just as we overcame violence as a feature of our politics by pursuing electoral reform and building institutions of the ECJ and making the budget allocations to fund it, similarly, I am confident that with the reforms, the institution building and funding that we have dedicated, we will overcome social violence and organized violence and crime. We will restore Jamaica to the peaceful, respectful, loving, civil, and pro-social values we embraced in 1962 as an independent nation. Madam Speaker, I am committed to this.
It won't stop at inner city people, at poor people, because it's only when it affects a certain geography, a certain area, that it apparently becomes a matter of concern that the state must act.
So we're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to enforce the law, and that is what we're doing. It is not an easy task to communicate this, because there are vested interests who want to turn this into a political issue for their political benefit. There must never be any political compromise about the rule of law. For decades we have been winking and being duplicitous and equivocal about the enforcement of the rule of law. And that is why we are where we are today. My job as your Prime Minister, I've passed the stage of trying to, or needing to win political popularity and favor. Doesn't matter to me anymore. I have to start to think about legacy. What will Jamaica be? Will it be the same as I came and saw it? I can't let Jamaica be the same as I came and saw it.